Hey guys, I miss y'all. We're starting part 2 of Unbroken, which is chapter 6 through 11. We're starting that today, and we're starting with chapter 6 to start us off. So, chapter 6 is titled The Flying Coffin, and this is actually a picture of one of the bombers. It's a B-24 Liberator. This is the kind of plane that Louis is going to fly in. So if you remember from the end of the last chapter that we were in, Louis, his dreams of running in the Olympics had been dashed because the war has started. And so instead of just sitting around and doing nothing, he enlists and goes into the war after Pearl Harbor. So this chapter is titled The Flying Coffin. Every chapter, if you've noticed, has a title that kind of gives us a clue as to what's going to happen in the next section. So I want you to think about why this is titled The Flying Coffin. Doesn't sound very good, does it? We're going to figure that out as we read. As we read, we're going to continue looking for themes, for central ideas, and for social issues. Now you're going to try, this week we're trying to find themes, stick with that theme that you found before, but to just see if you can add to it. Find examples of that theme. Like if you found the theme of perseverance, you've got to list the example of it, the detail of it from chapter 2 and the detail of it from chapter 6, and you got to follow it. So our goal is to follow themes, not come up with new ones, but follow different themes. Okay, so chapter 6, The Flying Coffin. As the Japanese planes dove over Oahu, some 2,000 miles west, Marines were sitting in a tent on Wake Atoll, eating pancakes. An atoll is an island. It's made from volcanic ash and lava that falls into the ocean and forms an island. So all these soldiers are sitting on this island, atoll, eating pancakes. The tiny atoll, a strategically critical airbase, was home to about 500 bored American servicemen, mostly Marines. Nothing interesting ever happened there. But that morning, as the Marines started on their pancakes, a siren began wailing. Soon the sky was streaked with Japanese bombers, buildings were exploding, and a few startled men found themselves on the front of the Second World War. All over the Pacific that morning, the story was the same. In less than 2 hours over Pearl Harbor, the Japanese mauled America's Navy and killed more than 2,400 people. Remember, Pearl Harbor is what happened that made Louis run out of the theater and join. Almost at the same time, they attacked Thailand, Shanghai, Malaya, the Philippines, Guam, Midway, and Wake. And in one day of breathtaking violence, Japan's main onslaught had begun. In America, invasion was expected at any moment, so they were worried Japan was going to invade them after this happened. In less than an hour after Japan bombed Hawaii, mines were laid out in the San Francisco Bay. So bombs were laid out there. In Washington, D.C., the civil defense minister looped around in a police car, sirens blaring, shouting, "Calm," into a loudspeaker. At the White House, a butler heard the president wondering what he'd do if Japanese forces advanced as far as Chicago. So they're all worried that Japan is gonna invade since Pearl Harbor. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to her daughter, urging her to flee the West Coast. In the subsequent days, trenches were dug along California beaches, windows across America were draped with blackout curtains, and bridges and tunnels and factories were put under guard. In Nebraska, citizens were taught how to disable fire bombs with garden hoses. Japan galloped all over the globe, invading the Philippines, Guam, Burma, Borneo, Rabaul, Hong Kong, and Singapore. But the tiny little island of Wake wouldn't give in. The Japanese bombed it for days, and then launched a massive invasion attempt. The little group of defenders shoved them back, and it wasn't until December that Japan finally captured Wake and the men on it. For days, the captives were held on the airfield, singing Christmas carols to cheer themselves, as the Japanese made plans to execute them. Then the plans were changed. Most of the captives were forced onto ships bound for Japan and occupied China as prisoners of war. 98 men were kept in Wake. The Japanese enslaved them. In August of 1942, Louis graduated from flight school as an officer, a second lieutenant. He drove to Torrance to say goodbye to his family before heading into the final round of training and then to war. But before he left, his family gathered on their front steps for a last picture. Louis put his arm around his mother, who was fighting back tears. His father rode with him to the train station, crowded with uniformed young men and crying parents. Embracing his father, Louis could feel him shaking. As his train pulled away, Louis looked back. His father stood with his hand up, a wavering smile on his face. Louis wondered if he would ever see him again. So this is the picture of him with his parents for the last time before he goes to war. And obviously, there's Louis on one side. He's the one right here. And Pete is right here. Okay. The train carried him to Ephrata, Washington, where an air base sat in a dry lake bed. The lake bed was determined to bury the base in blowing dirt, and it was succeeding. Men waded through drifts more than half a foot deep. All the mills were gritty with sand, and ground crews, which had to replace 20 dirt-clogged aircraft engines in 21 days, had to spray oil on the taxiways just to keep the dust down. Louis was standing in the dust, sweating, when a man walked up and introduced himself. He was Russell Allen Phillips. He would be Louis's pilot. The son of an Indiana pastor, Phillips was small, built like a fire plug. A gentle, generous-hearted young man. He was so quiet he could be in a room for hours before anyone would notice him. He had one consuming passion. Back at home, where everyone called him Alan, he had met a girl from the church choir named C.C. Perry. She had a curvy figure, a crazy disposition, a quick mind, and a family cat named Chopper. At a prom in Terre Haute, Alan had kissed C.C., and he was a goner, and so was she. On a Saturday night in November 1941, when he left for the Air Corps, Phillips spent his last 5 minutes with C.C. at the Indianapolis train station. When the fighting was over, he promised he'd make her his bride. And this is Russell Allen Phillips, but he goes by Phil in the book. In Ephrata, Louis and Phil became best friends. Phil floated along in Louis's chatty good humor. Louis liked Philip's quiet, kind steadiness. He called Louis Zamp, and Louis called him Phil. They never had an argument or were almost never apart. The rest of Louis's bomber crew assembled. The top turret gunner and engineer was Stanley Pillsbury. The other engineer was Clarence Douglas, who manned one of the 2 waist guns behind the wings. The navigator and nose gunner was Robert Mitchell. Frank Glassman was the belly gunner. So in this plane, they've got all these people that are in charge of different things. Like Louis the bomber. This is the pilot. There, I think, hold on. I don't know. This is the co-pilot. There's Louis, who's the bomber. And then you've got all these other men who are in charge of the guns, the big guns on the plane. All right. Frank Glassman was the belly gunner. Ray Lambert was the tail gunner. The radio man and second waist gunner was Harry Brooks. The co-pilot was George Mosnet Jr. Together, they'd be crew number 8 in the 9-crew 372nd Bomb Squadron. All of the men were bachelors except for Harry Brooks, like Phil, who had a steady girl back home. Her name was Jeanette, and she and Harry had set their wedding date for May 8th, 1943. All the crew needed was a plane. Everyone was hoping to be assigned a B-17, a handsome, fiercely armed, practically indestructible bomber. The plane nobody wanted was a giant new plane, Consolidated Aircraft Corporation's B-24 Liberator. So the picture of that plane that I showed you from chapter 1, or from the beginning of the chapter, nobody wants this plane. Nobody wants the B-24. On paper, the B-24 was comparable to the B-17 except for one major problem. It could fly literally all day without refueling. To the men, though, it left much to be desired. Flat-faced and rectangular, it looked like it had looks only a nearsighted mother could love. The crews called it the Flying Brick and the Constipated Lumberer to play on Consolidated Liberator. The cockpit was oppressively cramped. Navigating the narrow catwalk could be difficult. One slip and that you'd tumble into the bomb bay, which had fragile aluminum doors that would tear away with the weight of a falling man. The B-24's wheels had no steering, so when taxiing, the pilot had to coax the bomber along by powering one's side engines, then another, and working the left or right brakes, one of which was usually more sensitive than the other. So problems with this plane: one, the wheels don't turn on it. So like when it's landing, it can't turn its wheels either way to land. The room inside is so narrow that people are afraid they're going to fall into the bomb door, which is at the bottom of the plane, and then they'll fall out. Flying the B-24, one of the world's heaviest planes, was like wrestling a bear. Because the pilots strong-armed the yoke, the control lever, with their left hands, they were instantly recognizable when shirtless because the muscles on their left arms dwarfed those on their right. The plane was so clumsy that it was hard to fly in tight formations without hitting other planes. So it was really hard to steal. You had to use all your muscles. It also was plagued with mechanical problems. If one of the 4 engines died, staying airborne was challenging. If 2 of them died, it was an emergency. Early on, there were accidents in which B-24's tails fell off in midair, and the plane had a reputation for frailty, especially in the wings, which would snap off if struck in combat. Some men thought that plane was a death trap. When the 372nd Squadron planes flew in, Phil's crew walked out to look. Louis heard someone mutter, "It's the Flying Coffin." So they get the plane that is the Flying Coffin. For the next 3 months, the crew practically lived in their B-24. They flew in formation, fired at targets, and simulated combat runs. They buzzed so low over Iowa that the propellers kicked up a sandstorm, skinning the paint off of the plane's belly and scouring the legs of Pillsbury, sitting by the open tail hatch. Through it all, Louis perched in the glass-windowed greenhouse in the nose, bombing with superb proficiency. So here's where Louis is. This is the plane. So Louis is in the front, and he's a bomber. Okay. The squadron's prowess was soon well known. An angry farmer came calling after the 372nd's bombs flattened an outhouse. Training transformed Louis' crew. They worked together with seamless efficiency, and in the grim business of bombs and bullets, they were the squadron's best crew. So they turned out to be the best group that's working. The warmest praise would go to Phil. B-24s were built for tall pilots, and though small-statured, Phil needed to sit in a cushion to get his feet to the pedals and his eyes over the control panel. He was, in Louis' words, a darn swell pilot, dealing with adversity in calm, adaptive acceptance. The surprise of this pliant pilot, Louis would learn, was in a crisis, Phil was as brave as they came. The crew's B-24 had its own personality. It oozed fuel in the bomb bay, inspiring Pillsbury's nervous habit of pacing around sniffing the air. It loved venting deafening backfires. When nearing empty, the fuel gauges sometimes reported that the plane was magically gaining fuel. But for all of its quirks, the plane had never failed the men. It was a noble thing, rugged and inexhaustible, and they loved it. They named the plane Superman. And so here is a picture. So they drew Superman on the side of their plane. And so they named it Superman because even though it had all these problems, it never failed them. It never brought them down in enemy territory. It never crashed, so they called it Superman. In October of 1942, the men packed their bags. Their training was over, and they were being sent to Oahu to war, to Hawaii. Phil was very upset. Cece was about to come to see him, and they'd spoken about getting married. He would miss her by only 3 days. Before he left, Louis sent a package to his mother. In it were his airman's wings, and every morning as she waited for her boy to return, Louise pinned the wings onto her dress. Every night, she pinned them onto her nightgown. On November 2nd, Superman lifted off. Land slid away, and then there was nothing but the Pacific. Its bottom was already littered with downed warplanes and the ghost of lost airmen. Every day of this long and ferocious war, more and more would join them. So, they're flying to go to battle at their station in Hawaii, and it's just saying that the Pacific Ocean, where they're at now, is already full of downed planes where the planes have lost control.